All right, welcome to the Week 3 Forum. This week we are starting Unit 2, and we're looking at one particular ideology, conservatism. The first thing we have to note is that conservatism is easy to understand, but hard to define. It's easy to understand because most human beings have some innately conservative impulses. Um, that is just to say that most of us like to establish patterns in our lives that help us make sense of reality and facilitate our presentation of ourselves as competent, rational beings. In its most colloquial sense, conservatism refers to the urge to conserve, a sentiment that inclines us to be at least a little bit anxious at the prospect of change. Beyond that literal sense, however, there's considerable disagreement over what constitutes conservatism, which is why the authors view conservatism as a house divided. While individualist conservatives and libertarians embrace laissez-faire capitalism, cultural conservatives worry about the impact of capitalism, red in tooth and claw, on the social fabric of communities. And while most conservatives prefer change in small, slow, evolutionary doses, reactionaries are often willing to resort to radical means in order to stop what they believe is a race towards disaster, in order to return to some idealized past. I would also note that as an ideology, conservatism has more ancient roots than does liberalism. I certainly think that a case can be made that a good deal of ancient political thought had conservative implications, by which I mean that the ancients displayed considerable concern for preserving culture and existing distributions of power and authority. Contemporary conservatives often punctuate their reservations about democracy as a universal ideal by drawing on Plato and Aristotle's critiques of democracy, especially direct democracy, as kind of rule by the mob. Um, the authors consider Edmund Burke, an an Irish-English aristocrat and statesman, as sort of the archetypal modern conservative. What are some of the critical features of Burke's thought that mark him out as conservative? To me, one of the aspects of Burke's thought that I find particularly to be emblematic of conservatism is the idea of little platoons. Burke was no totalitarian. He believed that government could be enlightened and relatively inclusive, and that good government should draw on the natural aristocracy to govern fairly. The little platoons refer to the intermediary institutions embedded in civil society, the informal nodes of tradition, power, and authority that lie uncultivated by central government, that stand between the individual and the government. Um, to illustrate, let me think of a little sort of parallel for contemporary times. 75 years ago, every small town in America had as the backbone of its citizenry the owners of small businesses, a small grocery store, an independent hardware or sporting goods store, a doctor with a small practice. Frequently, this small cadre of business owners provided the town's leadership. They were also the mayors and the city councilors and leading citizens that attended, city council meetings. Then came big box stores, Walmart and the other big stores, Bass Pro Shops and everything else. And what happened to small towns in America? Where are today's hardware or sporting goods store owners? Where the corner grocery store or the small independent gas station once stood, now they've been replaced. Today it's the managers of Walmart and Quick Trip and Dollar General that occupy those spots. But even where they might own a franchise, they're really just a link in a much larger corporate structure. Does this description sound like a Burkean critique of the direction that the United States has been going over the past, half century or more? Having read this chapter, what kind of conservatives would advance this kind of argument? Um, the authors also point to some important intellectual wellsprings of conservative thought. One important wellspring I find interesting is the counter-enlightenment, which arose in the early and mid-19th century in reaction to the spreading influence of the Enlightenment's emphasis on science and reason as bases for knowledge, and Enlightenment thinkers' sunny predictions about the unlimited human progress towards perfection. I mentioned in the weekly overview that one of the unifying convictions among conservatives is a rather dismal pessimism with regard to human nature and the prospects for human perfectibility. Counter-Enlightenment thinkers like Joseph de Maistre believed that most human beings were incapable of rational action and needed to be constrained by the majesty of the crown and the threat of eternal damnation in order to avoid descending into utter madness. What do you think about human nature? Are you conservative? Do you think that human beings are not very capable of autonomously governing themselves? Do you see evidence of what you would characterize as reactionary thinking in contemporary politics? What kinds of examples can you think of? Uh, Conservatism in the United States is quite a bit different than in other countries, particularly European countries that have a thousand year history with feudalism to inform their conservatism. American conservatives tend to be more closely aligned with classical laissez-faire versions of liberalism, believing in small government and generally as little regulation of economic activity as possible. But there are a couple of other important sources of American conservatism. And one of them is the agrarian tradition of the Deep South, which displays many of the traits seen in European cultural conservatism. A distinctively elite bias combined with a real skepticism towards democratic practices are prominent among them. The authors mentioned the book I'll Take My Stand, written in 1930 by a collection of authors known as the Southern Agrarians, who espoused a kind of Jeffersonian, Madisonian ideal of an agrarian society as innately more virtuous than the industrial societies of the northern states. What do you think about this argument that rural, uh, agriculturally oriented communities are in some way uh, morally superior or more virtuous than urban populations? This should give you a pretty good basis for jumping into a discussion for this week. What aspects of conservatism do you find most persuasive? Or alternatively, which aspect most offends you? Are there any aspects of this chapter that you had difficulty understanding? Please ask me about it. I'll be happy to try and clear it up if I can. Let's have a great week of discussion.